Welcome back to another episode of Founders Club. I'm your host, Dez DeCosta. Today's guest is Ujwal Arkalgud, a cultural anthropologist turned entrepreneur who built and sold a high eight-figure company without a single dollar of VC funding. He's here to share how understanding human behavior and the invisible rules of perception can unlock growth, credibility, and game-changing results for founders. Ujwal, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Des.
Of course, so excited to dive deeper. Let's start at the beginning. What led you to studying cultural anthropology and to building and selling a multi-million dollar business? What was that like?
I actually grew up in India, and in India, especially if you grow up in a middle class household, if you don't know what you're going to do next, you end up in an engineering program because there's so many engineering schools. And so I ended up in an engineering program, really hated it. And during that time, somebody handed me a book that was sort of summarizing the field of social cultural anthropology, especially, the period of philosophy after, let's say, the 1920s. And I just got really interested in it because a lot of the questions they were asking were about, what we now, I guess, refer to as human psychology. Why do we think the way we think? Why do we believe what we believe? And those why questions really got me realizing that that was my passion. And so while I don't have a degree in cultural anthropology, I've basically spent the last 15 years of my life reading any book imaginable in the field, everything from, philosophy books to, very practical application books. So that's kind of where it all began. But, I was working in advertising and I tried to pitch this idea of using anthropology to start a market research tech firm. And my bosses at the time didn't quite see the value of that. And so I said, okay, now's the time if I'm ever going to get a chance to bring this vision to life, give myself a chance of having a career in anthropology. The only way to do that was if I started a business because I didn't have a PhD in anthropology. I didn't have the academic background that you typically expect. So that's kind of how it all started for me.
Got it. Okay. So transitioning into this field, would you say you encountered any challenges along the way, or what were the
Oh
biggest
yeah.
hurdles? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, early on I started to realize that, the world is, and somebody gave me this analogy, I can't remember who, but the world is made up of Lego blocks. And if you want to do something, you have to appear like a Lego block that fits perfectly in place. If you don't, you will encounter all kinds of hurdles and challenges, right? So if I wanted to work in the field of market research as an anthropologist, I need a PhD in anthropology. I need work experience, none of which I had, right? And so when I started the business, I started it kind of because I had no other choice. I wanted to create a career for myself in this field, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to give this a shot." And that's kind of how it began. But I'll tell you when it started, I did what every other entrepreneur does when they want to start a business. They read all the books, and I think, okay, I have to go pitch angel investors and VCs because I didn't have any cash. I don't come from a wealthy background. I had student loans that I was paying off, all the usual stuff. And so I remember going to an angel investor network and I pitched them and I walked out of there. And, they basically just kept critiquing my business plan. They kept critiquing my product. But I found every time they would criticize something, they would always come back to this idea of not having enough experience or not having the right credentials. Like, will customers buy from you? Will they believe that you're credible? All these kinds of questions were sort of the unwritten rejection letter. You know what I mean? And so this is how the idea of invisible rules actually was born for me, that I had this aha moment because, that's what the field of cultural anthropology teaches you, that when we talk to each other as human beings, we say one thing, we mean something else. And we see this, even in relationships, like my wife and I are having an argument. we're saying one thing, we mean something else, and you got to get to the bottom of that to solve the argument. Same thing in business. And so I realized very quickly that if I had any chance of being successful as an outsider, I had to crack this invisible game. Right? That's kind of how it all started for me.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I mean, it's something that never had a name, really, which you dubbed, right? And something that was always there, but we just never really talked about. And,
Exactly.
based on everything you're saying and what I've seen you put out before, you said that the key to success isn't, in business particularly, isn't just having a good product. It's about perception, right? So let's dive deeper into that. Can you explain what you mean by that and why it matters so much?
Yeah, I coined the term invisible rules because I wanted a way to explain that the having the best product in market is not enough. The way you are, so there's kind of three ways in which buyers, investors will judge you. Um, there's, three prongs to the stool. It's about attention, it's about credibility, and then it's about a trigger for investment, to buy, to invest, what have you. Now, what I found very quickly is that you get attention if, let's say, you have the right experience, you're an industry insider, you know the right people. You get credibility if you speak the right language. When I say language, I don't mean English. I mean using the right words that the industry insiders use. You get credibility if you come from certain institutions. If you've worked at Google, as an example, then you get credibility in Silicon Valley, stuff like that, right? So there's all these unwritten codes. And then the same thing applies, I found, when you're trying to get investment, right? And so I started to look into this idea of saying, okay, so if I can figure out what these unwritten codes are there ways for me to hack it? So I'll give you one example. I discovered that, okay, because I wasn't credible, I didn't have a PhD, I hadn't worked as an anthropologist anywhere before, and I suddenly had this company and I was trying to sell to McDonald's and, selling to General Mills and Target and all these big corporations. And I realized very quickly that if I had a point of view about their industry, about, my industry, but it had to be counterintuitive. So all I had to do was find something the industry believes that may not necessarily be correct. It's just a belief. And every industry has this, there's so many ideas that just why do you do it this way? Because we've just done it this way. Right.
Yeah,
And so all I had to do was find one of those and then immediately bring up that counterintuitive insight and show people why that might not be accurate. And immediately the other person not only leans in, right, but they also immediately assign you credibility.
I see.
So I discovered all these hacks of ways to get myself attention, credibility when I didn't have the traditional check marks. You know what I mean? And so
Yes.
that kind of became the game. So the 7 years of building my business, I felt like I was playing a game and trying to master this game. And that's why I wrote the book after, because that's kind of where I really started to kind of hone the craft.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's dive into that then. So your new book, called Invisible Rules, right?
Yeah.
So that's what inspired you to write it, just based on your story and what worked for you, having to take a more alternative route in your industry.
Yeah.
What's the biggest idea you hope readers take away from it?
I think the biggest idea is that in our culture, in our society, we are given ideas. We are constantly bombarded with ideas of what success should look like. Who should that successful person be? What should they look like? What kind of life should they have? Right? And we're bombarded with this on social media, on TV, what have you. Right? And what happens is that they they become internalized ideas. We don't even realize it. We internalize it. So you may be somebody who doesn't look like a typical entrepreneur, right? You may be somebody who doesn't have the experience of a typical entrepreneur. You may be somebody who's never worked in tech. You may be somebody who's not tech savvy. All of these things are reasons why people go, "Ah, I shouldn't start a business. I've always wanted to start a business. I shouldn't start it because of blah, blah, blah."
Right.
So the first thing I want people to take away is to ask the question, am I preventing myself from doing something because I genuinely believe I can't do it? Or is it because society has ingrained this idea into my head and it's actually limiting my own, it's actually taking away permission from me to
Yes.
want to take the next step. So that's one aspect. So now let's say I analyze that and I take that next step. I wanted to give people a way outside of the insider's path and the venture-backed path. So the insider's path is you already know people in your industry. The venture-backed path is you've raised a bunch of money from VC, right? That's less than 1% of businesses. 99% of businesses don't know anybody in the industry. You're an outsider, you don't have any money, and you want to make it. So that's my focus in the book. And I call it the invisible rules because I want to give people a new pathway. Let's call it the rule master's pathway. So if you can master these rules, you have a shot at building a business that gives you fulfillment, that gives you joy. You don't have to build a unicorn. You can build a very successful 7, 8, 9-figure business and be really happy in your life. And I think that's really my goal with that book.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, that's amazing. I know that there are a lot of founders listening, and for those who are listening, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see early on that entrepreneurs make when trying to reach a either product market fit or raise capital? What does that look like?
Yeah, fantastic question. So the biggest one is people don't have a point of view on the industry. We talked briefly about this earlier. It is the most critical thing. In fact, whenever a founder reaches out to me for some guidance or for some help, that's the first question I ask them. I ask them what they think about their industry and what's their unique perspective. And I have this, I always tell people you shouldn't be selling features, you should be selling a new perspective, a new way of doing things. That's what people buy because you can't win the feature war. Somebody else has more money than you and they will build faster than you and they will market harder than you. So, what you can win is the perception game. So, you have to have a unique perspective. So, what is a unique perspective? I talked about it to wire the brain to create the scarcity gap, the curiosity gap. It has to be counterintuitive. So then people often ask me, how do I go figure that out? I'll give you a simple 3-step process. Go to the biggest industry conference and go into the busiest sessions. So sessions where the popular speakers have jam-packed room and start to pay attention and take notes, maybe even record them on your phone and start to look for things that they all share in common, a viewpoint about your industry, and there'll be many of them. Poke holes in any one of those viewpoints, and that becomes your counterintuitive POV, right? Obviously, it has to relate to what service you're offering in the industry, but that's how you can figure it out. It doesn't take much to figure that out. And then that POV becomes how you go to market, how you pitch investors, how you pitch customers. It becomes the opening line when you're about to hop on with a prospect. You don't discuss the weather. You begin with the counterintuitive POV. In networking, you don't ask people if they would like a drink or what city they're from or if they have children. You begin with the counterintuitive POV.
Mm.
We were able to scale our business well past 5 million in ARR, annual recurring revenue, with zero salespeople, Des. And people always ask me, how did you do that? Just with this. The strategy is simple. The execution is hard, by the way. It requires a lot of work.
That's wonderful. And you foreshadowed for us a little bit here because I'm going to ask you about that next. But a follow-up question I have with everything that you had just mentioned here, not really even a question, kind of just an observation, right? I, at this point in my journey, have a lot of, very successful business entrepreneurs on my social media and various social media channels. Um, and one thing that I did notice when they do roll out daily new content is how they frame their perspective when writing that content, whether they write it or somebody else write it or
Love
AI.
it.
AI might write it these days, but whatever the case might be, it does always start with an idea that's being changed or twist that something may have already, existed for a long time in the industry, whatever industry that they're in. And then later on, as far as them doing that over and over and over again with their content, they become dubbed a thought leader. So a
That's right.
thought leader in their space, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely can see what you're talking about there and wanted to make that relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny because, on Instagram, everybody talks about the hook, right? You need a good hook on the
Mhm.
video. But that's what a hook is. A hook is I'm scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. Why would I stop? Because I see something that I'm not expecting. And then maybe I hear something that is challenging a perspective or an assumption I have,
Yeah.
and now I'm hooked for a few more seconds, right? And
Right.
so that's exactly it. It's just human psychology. And I think, to me, what's interesting is if you look at all the startup playbooks out there, all the new business playbooks, they'll all talk about, like, even on Instagram, there's so many influencers, they're all saying, oh, just do this 5-part system and you'll generate $1 million in sales, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I'm by no means poo-pooing any of that. A lot of them are really successful at implementing those systems. But what I find really interesting is none of them talk about the psychological side. Because the buying equation, if you look at research in behavioral science, if you look at research in social sciences, more than 95% of our decisions as human beings, even in business to business context, is
Hmm.
all emotional. We've
Yeah.
made the decision in the first few seconds of talking to somebody if we find them interesting and if we want to potentially work with them. The rest is all just filling the logical gaps. And I try to really, to me, that's what's exciting is that in this field of entrepreneurship, there's just not enough being talked about around that space.
Sure thing. You know what? If just for myself personally, if there's somebody who can challenge a belief or an opinion that I have held for a long time in a way that's not completely creating so much friction that piques my interest, but then I actually changes my opinion, I have a lot of respect for that. And I think that's also where it comes from. I
Absolutely.
respect whatever XYZ person or influencer thing or company it might be that does that because I'm like, all right, well, I have something different I can believe. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in your company, MotivBase, you mentioned you grew it to $5 million in annual revenue without a single sales hire, right? That's super important. How did you build that kind of traction? You kind of already touched on this a little bit, but what role did human behavior and psychology play in that growth?
Yeah.
Mention
So,
a little bit more. Let's dive deeper into that.
yeah, I mean, we scaled the business well past 5 mil, but the
Okay.
first 5 mil, we did it with zero salespeople. After that, we ended up hiring because we were achieving scale and we needed help.
Mhm.
But the way we got there was we realized very quickly that, there was no point in trying to hustle or pound the pavement, trying to get people to pick up a call or, answer our emails and then kind of go through the motions. And you're just noise, right? And we didn't want to be noise. And so what we realized is that if we had a very strong point of view, we could make that the carrot and we could bring the horse to water, so to speak. So our entire strategy. So I remember in year one, we started. And by the way, I think part of the story that's also really interesting, and I try to talk about this a lot, is that because I didn't have any funds to start a technology business, I actually started as a consulting business. And our first 4 years, we were a consulting business. We scaled past 5 million revenue, and then we had to kill everything because we were investing in building a technology. So we transitioned from a consulting business to a SaaS business in year five, and then over the next 2 to 3 years, started to scale all over again. Um, but the reason I mentioned that is, in the first year we hit 1.5 million in revenue, and the way we did it is we took our counterintuitive POV. First, we tested it, right? So we put that into emails, and we found we were getting responses much higher than average rates for a cold email. And then we'd get on the phone, and we found people were leaning in; they were interested in what we had to say. I'll give you an example. I was recently talking to somebody who runs a cybersecurity product company, an entrepreneur, and he was telling me that I was asking him, okay, when you hop on the phone, what is it that you're selling? He was saying, oh, it's peace of mind, right? And I said to him, no, there's nothing counterintuitive about that. And I was pushing him, and he went, oh, I know what it is, because every entrepreneur has it in their heads. And he says, what if your firewall, whatever you have in place currently, it lulls you into a false sense of security? And that's the thing. That's the reason why you need to talk to me. And I was like, there you go. Right. And suddenly one little switch, and suddenly
Yeah.
he's having very different sales conversations. Right. So once we figured that out, what we did is we went to every major industry conference, and I got myself a speaking slot in as many as I could. And so in every one of those conferences, I did a talk on the same topic, this counterintuitive POV, right? So if you were a cybersecurity guy, you'd be doing the counterintuitive talk on why your firewall or your existing solution lulls you into a false sense of security, right? And then we put the same content on LinkedIn, and then we did paid media on it. And lo and behold, we didn't have to do a single outreach. Clients just came to us. My favorite one was, I remember ConAgra Foods called us, and we closed $300,000 in business in 3 business days. And they called us,
Mhm.
right? So stuff like this. And I think people don't realize how important this is. But Daz, like 99% of the founders I meet, they have nothing original to say. It's in
Right.
their heads, don't get me wrong. That's
Uh-huh.
why they started the business. But they
Yeah.
have nothing original to say publicly. They haven't figured it out.
hmm And you know what? You're so right. We all kind of, when we are trying to create our LinkedIn header, they say, okay, put how you solve, or what problem do you solve, right? What problem do
Exactly.
you solve? What is it that you do? And create your quick elevator pitch that way. But what's not the counterintuitive POV? That's
No.
something
I
that's
saw
great.
this.
Yeah.
There's this video on Instagram that's going around.
hmm
I forget who, but it's like, I think, millions of views, about how to network properly.
Right.
And this author said, you gotta be very clear about what problem you're solving. And when you meet people, you tell them what problem you're solving, because they'll remember that when they have that problem. And the problem for me with that approach is
Yes.
that you're so forgotten 30 seconds later,
Yeah.
right? And you have to realize that in a conference like that, in a networking session, there are 10 people, 20 people, 100 people solving the exact same problem,
hmm
right? And so, however, if I go there and say, hey, I work in the cybersecurity business, and by the way, did you know that this is exactly the reason why all these malware and all these ransomware issues happen? That's an interesting conversation starter. You're not trying to sell people straight away. You're starting a genuine discussion, and somebody's going, hey, this person is credible. They know enough about my industry that I can have a good conversation with them.
Right. I mean, even the strategy that we were also been told, which is, let people talk, figure out their pain points. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Oh,
right. So, okay,
yeah,
I can do that, but as you've mentioned, there are so many others who could do the same thing, figure out their pain points and solve them and fill those gaps.
exactly. So,
Mhm.
Des, on that, we used to do this strategy that I've written about. I call it the junior circuit. So the problem was, let's say, you're selling something and the buyer is a director level at, I don't know, mid-sized companies. And you're desperately trying to get calls with the director because they're the ones who sign the check. Um, my realization very early on was that if you get on with the director and you ask her freaking 20 questions about their problem, they're so bored, because this is how every sales call goes, right? There's nothing
Right.
memorable. But I need those answers, to your point. I do need those answers. So what we would do is we'd call the underlinks. We try to find the people who've just worked in the company a year, 6 months, who are more willing to talk to us. We'd message them and say, hey, we're doing some research, trying to understand what the problems are. And you know what would happen? We'd hop on the call and they would tell us everything, the politics internally, what pressure they think their boss's boss is under, why. And so when we went on the call with the director, we were so prepared It's hard work. You got to go do other calls before you. But the thing is, we realize that you get one shot with these buyers. You miss your shot, you got to wait another year because you can't keep bombarding these people if once you've missed your shot.
Yeah.
Instead, when you have the director now, you take all the knowledge, you combine it with your POV, your counterintuitive POV, and now suddenly you are so interesting in the first 90 seconds that the director is like, who the heck is this guy? I want to
Yeah.
talk to him,
How did you get
right?
in touch with the folks that had only been working there for about 6 months to a year, and why were they so willing to share?
So the thing is, people who are newer or who are younger in the organization,
Mhm.
they're generally not given the respect that, the tenured folks get, right? Because all the pitches, everything happens to directors, the senior managers, VPs. And so when you're a junior manager or, you're a junior whatever, um, everybody needs their ego fill. So when somebody reaches out to them and says, "Hey, I think you have a unique perspective because you're newer in the industry, we want a fresh perspective," they're like, "Oh yeah." So again, human psychology, right? And and you're not lying to them. You're doing research to understand the industry, and they'll hop on with you and you talk to them and understand the industry. And by the way, later when the director buys from you, guess who you have to work with? The underlings.
Yes.
And at that point, they already know you and they're like, hey, we've met before and they like you. And, the rest is easier.
That's so true, huh? Yes, because once a decision is made from the top, the adoption is just going to happen.
It's going to
You know,
come back down anyway.
exactly. Yeah. Wow, this is wonderful. You've definitely been able to shift my opinion, like I said, and for that I have so much respect for you and the work that you're doing. Where can people find you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I have a newsletter. I think the easiest is to check out invisible-rules.com, invisible-rules.com. I have a
Okay.
newsletter that I write weekly. That newsletter is very much geared towards how-tos, exactly like this examples we were talking about.
Yes,
I've
yeah.
also recently gone on Instagram and I'm trying to, bring some of the how-to knowledge to Instagram as well. So you can find me ujwal.arkalgud on Instagram. It's new to me, and I should point out I have nothing to sell on Instagram. It's just another way for me to kind of spread the knowledge that I've gained.
Yeah.
I'm not selling courses. Uh,
Awesome.
I'm
Well,
not trying to
that's
I'm not
amazing.
trying to lure people into a funnel. Nothing. It's
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
sharing my knowledge. And then, of course, I have a book, Invisible Rules, coming out. It's not coming out until March. I've just finished the last round of edits, and then I have to do the audiobook and all that jazz. And how the publishing industry is. But I'm really excited. So, please subscribe to my newsletter so you'll hear when the book launches and you can be part of the early crew.
Wonderful. March of next year, 2026.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good. Well, there's so much to look forward to with you. I am excited to follow you on your journey, especially with the examples that you gave us today. I'm so interested in learning more about all of this, the psychological side of it, and, learn more in the developments of, the POV side of everything. But thank you so much for your time, Ujwal.
Thanks so much, Des. I really appreciate it.